Meow! The Armchair Pepper reads, In a Perfect World is a 2009 novel with a long pandemic that goes on for about a year and then has a bit of a kick at the end of it, and it's quite fascinating. The author, I'm going to massacre her name, Laura Kasischke, she has written a bunch of books, none of which I've ever read. I read this because I am interested in dystopian literature, and this is a form of dystopian literature. It's also kind of a disaster poem, but it actually has a few bits and pieces in it that's good. The language and the writing and everything else in the scene setting is wonderful. Basically, there will be spoilers. I will try and avoid a lot of them, but there will be spoilers. So the back place tells you this. This is the way the world ends. It was a fairy tale come true when Mark Dawn, handsome pilot, widower, tragic father of three, chose Giselle to be his wife. The other flight attendants were jealous. She could quit now, leaving behind the million daily irritations of the job. Since the outbreak of the Phoenix flu, passengers have become even more difficult and nervous, and a life of constant travel had grown harder. She could move into Mark Dawn's precious log cabin and help him raise his 3 beautiful children. But fairy tales aren't like marriage or motherhood. With Mark almost always gone, Giselle finds herself alone and lonely. She suspects that Mark's daughters hate her, and the Phoenix flu, which Giselle had thought of as a passing hysteria, when she had thought of it at all, well, it turns out the Phoenix flu will change everything for Giselle, for a new family, and for the life she thought she had chosen. So I think it's fair to say it's a book about married life, it's a book about compromise, it's a book about entering a family that's already established, and on top of all that you have a flu pandemic that's not raging but is everywhere for over a year before it gets quite bad. Kitty asked me what I thought, and I think it's a B+ for me, not an A. I enjoyed it. It was an easy read, and Kitty's going to read it and she will give me her take on it. So the book has one of the best starts of any book. Probably there are a few of us out there that have better ones, but this is pretty good. If you're reading this, you're going to die. She's reading one of her stepdaughter's diaries. It introduces you to the scene, it introduces you to her role within the scene in a couple of paragraphs. Quite beautiful language, talks about violets and flowers and droughts, because there's also a huge drought going on here. A high, piercing, horrible, girlish scream that made all of the little hairs on Giselle's arms rise, and a cool film of sweat break out on the back of her neck. She whipped around, heart pounding, and hurried back into the kitchen, a hand covering her mouth. Of course the violet hadn't screamed. It seemed quietly where she had placed it, drooping over the side of the shot glass. If anything, it looked more defeated than it had a few seconds before. Head bowed in acceptance over the shot glass, as if patiently awaiting for the axe. It would never have been capable of screaming. That had been Sarah, at the news that Britney Spears was dead. So there is a few real characters in this book who aren't actually characters who are just referred to from news stories or whatever. And Britney Spears, unfortunately, tragically died in 2009 from the Phoenix flu. Some of this stuff's fairly prescient when she talks about the Phoenix flu. Oftentimes it's actually the unseen narrator talking about the flu rather than the main character Giselle, though it's given the impression that it is Giselle, but I think it's actually a narrator. Some had said it was the heat that was causing the Phoenix flu, which health experts were no longer referring to as the Phoenix flu, but as a hemorrhagic zoonosis, because it was not an influenza, they said, but an antibiotic vaccine-resistant strain of Yersinia pestis. This flu starts in America, starts in Phoenix, and the world quarantines, isolates, and hates America. And America's also in an unnamed war. Quarantining oneself, experts agreed, was futile. The virus could be in the water, in the dirt, in the air. Who knew? It could take years to discover the source of the infection, and more years to find a cure. Most people quit trying to guess where it might be and how to avoid it, and simply went on with their daily lives. A poll asking how concerned are you about the Phoenix flu reported that 61% of Americans were not very concerned. Another 10% were not concerned at all. But this flu is a character in this book. It's not a described menace, but it's a background instability. Giselle's unstable in her marriage. She's unstable at no longer working as a airline stewardess. She's not comfortable with children. She now has 3 of them. And she's in this strange, isolated life in rural mid-America. Now, she wrote this in 2009. Far more people are not going to die of the Phoenix flu than die of it, one television doctor said in a special news report. We'd better keep attending school, paying our bills and floating the economy. Otherwise, when the hysteria dies down, we'll have something to be hysterical about. Healthy people, it was said, could easily withstand this flu. It was only killing the aged and the infirm. I guess Britney Spears would be infirm. So about a third of the way through the book, one of the neighbours, who seems to be a bit of a prepper but turns out to be a YouTube prepper, not with a channel, but those people who like to talk about surviving everything but really don't really have much preps. Tip of the iceberg, tornadoes, tsunamis, hold your hat on. Ever read about the Black Death? It was all of these. Before the plague did its worst work, the floods, the winds, the earthquakes, you wait. There was no mistaking the tone in his voice for anything other than excitement. Now throughout this whole book, there's periods where the lights go on and off, and because of the infrastructure's failing and they're not able to maintain the infrastructure and people are sick. So the power comes on, the power comes off. So the power doesn't, generally speaking in the book, ever stay off forever. But it will go for a week or 2, 3 weeks at a time. Gradually, very gradually, so gradually the characters aren't really noticing it except occasionally when they're forced to. Their own society, their comfortable American society, normal America, is gradually dying. Yes, the streetlights were completely dark against an ever-darkening sky. The signs that usually lit up the billboards were off. The only light besides the shredded bits of moon overhead came from the headlights streaming towards them on the other side of the freeway. Then Giselle noted not only the absence of streetlights, but also the absence of traffic headed into the city. It was all headed out. Weird, Giselle said, more to herself than to Camellia. Camellia is the middle daughter. She kept driving until they reached their exit, 10 miles later, and pulled off the freeway to find the city streets were nearly empty. No pedestrians. All the store and restaurant windows were dark. I believe they've gone to Boston, but don't quote me on that. Giselle was just slowing down outside Duke's Palace Inn, noting the unlit sign outside when her cell phone rang. The caller ID read, Mother, block capper. Don't tell me you drove all the way into the city. For God's sake, Giselle, don't you listen to the radio? No, she didn't. It was impossible. In one car with Camellia, Sam and Sarah, they're the 3 kids, to find a station or even a CD they could agree on. They always rode in silence. No, Giselle said, I'm here. Well, go home and hope your power's on. I'm on my way back, unlike you. I heard it on the radio and turned around. Oh, Giselle said, should I? You should go home, her mother said. All the sane people are on their way home. Nothing will be open in the city. Giselle said goodbye then and happy Valentine's Day and said that she would call in the morning, by which time the power would be back on, surely, and she and her mother would perhaps make their plans for lunch. Normalcy bias. So they had no problems driving into the city in this huge national blackout, but instead of staying for a few days at her mother's place, even though her mother's on her way back there, they should have stayed in place. Maybe camouflaged the car, jacked it up, took the wheels off and put them in the house with a battery. A few things you can do to protect the vehicle, and then waited for it to calm down and leave. They think things are normal. So they head back out, and what they encounter is massive, massive traffic jams. To make it worse, there's an ice storm going on, nobody's ploughing, nobody's desalting, and it takes them forever to get back. One of the beauties of this book, there are no set pieces that you would normally see in prepper fiction. No man comes and attacks them, they don't have any gun battles. It's the repetition of boredom, the absence of electricity, the absence of normal society, the absence of the father, the husband, Mark Dawn. There is no cohesive ability in the group to function as a group initially, because for various reasons which become tragically apparent at the end and get resolved, the 3 kids, apart from the child, the young boy, don't really like her. And that is explained. I'm not going to tell you why, because that's part of the magic of the book, is what is actually going on. Why do the kids hate her? What's her actual relationship with Mark? What is actually going on? So everything's out, but Walmart has generators and Walmart stays open. This is where Giselle's actually acting. She's in normalcy bias, there's nothing much going on, it's a slow gradual decrease, but because of this blackout, because she has the opportunity to stop at Walmart, she acts. Sam and Giselle went into the Walmart, where flashlights and candles were being sold faster than they could be hauled out of the stockroom. Damn, the pregnant girl in one of the red vests said. Every store closed for miles around, Walmart's still up and running. It can't last, the old woman said. Power's out from here to the city. The lights overhead surged. The cash registers all beeped and buzzed at the same time. A cheer and a sigh, and the pregnant girl's audible groan went up throughout the store. The real electricity, not the generated electricity, was back on. Everybody was happy. Everybody drops what they're doing. Everybody goes home. Panic over. The hubbub subsided, and with it the sense of rush and excitement. The crisis was over. Sam said, "Can we still get flashlights?" Sam's 6 years of age. Giselle looked at him. The rims of his ears were red. She could see through his scalp, through the soft hair growing back on his head. Of course, there's nothing Sam liked more than a new gadget. A can opener would have sufficed, but Giselle said, "Let's get a hole punch." "Cool," he said. So a lot of people in the lineups have flashlights and candles and stuff like that. And when the power comes back for normal, panic over, they just dump them down and walk out the store. So she's able to get a lot of flashlights. No sooner had they reached the electric doors to Walmart, bearing their plastic bags, than the power surged, brightening strangely, before the lights went out again, just as the door slid open, this time plunging Walmart into total darkness. Giselle lit a candle, put it on the table and turned on the radio. Apparently the outage had swept the Midwest to the East Coast, a power grid problem. "The infrastructure of this country is collapsing," a caller shouted. "This isn't the weather, this is the collapse of culture." On another station, a caller calls in and blames it on the flu. "People are dying. We're not going to be able to help keep the lights on." So the doom prophets are there, but nobody's actually doing anything to mitigate or stop the flu. Nobody's actually doing anything to mitigate or stop the whole dependency on the national grid, to make the grid stronger, or to make it more local and more resilient. Nobody's doing anything other than just existing between blackouts and then acting mostly like normal. So Marcos is an airline pilot, that's how they met. She was an air stewardess, and he's flown to Germany, and his entire American crew have been shoved into quarantine, detained in Germany. So he ain't coming back in the foreseeable future. So she's now thrust on her own with 3 kids, one of whom loves her as a little boy, and the 2 older girls apparently hate her guts. This is going to be a tough adjustment. So we talked that little groups are forming into the earth and all this stuff, but they only have a tiny effect on this. But I think this is a really key way of looking at any major slow-moving SHTF. But most of the people Giselle saw around town simply seemed bored. There had never been so many people in Santa Sofia. Stuck in Santa Sofia, spending their days in Santa Sofia without school, without power, without sports, without work, without the malls in the city and the suburbs open. They were wired with energy and exhausted at the same time. They were actually sat on their park benches, which had seemed to be merely decorations to sell until then. Mothers pushed children on the swings in the park. They walked on the sidewalks. Remember, this is American culture, so we're very much car dependent. So Mark's able to call her fairly frequently from Germany. It's hype backs it over the phone, the whole thing. The pharmaceutical companies and the European Union have a lot of money to make over this hype. And that's called denial. When you look at a pandemic or you look at an SHTF and you say, not there, it's not true. It's very hard to manipulate people into actually having a global pandemic and actually fake hospitals full across the world. But obviously with something that moves slow like the Phoenix flu, and here is a clear parallel with COVID-19, the areas hit are very geographically dispersed, and oftentimes the age groups and the race of the people being hit is also very specific, at least in the beginning. So it's very easy for people to look at it and say, I don't know anybody's had this is rubbish. There's no flu cases this year, it's just flu. Totally not true, but the same thing happens in this book, written in 2009. The good decision she had made had nothing to do with her consciousness, as it turned out. They'd been lucky guesses. She'd known somehow that flour would be important, so before the shortages had bought 12 pounds of it. And sugar, baking powder, a can of Crisco, a thing she had never even seen up close before she bought it. Now late mornings when the power was on, she could use the oven. She'd make muffins to last a week. She'd learned too how to take care of fresh food. Potatoes and onions lasted an amazingly long time in the cool. Bouillon cubes, cabbages, apples. She'd torn from a page in an old magazine how to actually cook old-fashioned food. She learns that if she soaks the beans for a long period of time, they cook in about an hour. So she's still getting cash because the airline's deposit marks cash into the bank, and she's able to get money out of the bank for quite some time into this thing. So at a certain point she decides to make a point of stocking up. She realises that she actually needs to make sure that she and her family are protected. She stocked the cupboards and filled the boxes in the cellar with canned food and dried fruit after hearing a woman on the radio say one day, "I'm stocking up on food. I know you've been warned not to hoard. Protecting your family is not the same as hoarding." Well, yeah, maybe. I'm a hoarder of food. I don't intend to die. I don't intend to have enough food to last 3 months to 6 months and then hope that the lights come back on and the government starts to feed us again and the stores open. The chances are that any SHTF would only last for days to a few weeks. Chances are things that are missing would be in short supply for a period of time and then return. You might see various products that you normally see start to disappear and not come back. Things like you might start to see imported melons and things like that just disappearing. Up here you might no longer see walnuts, you may no longer see macadamia nuts, a whole bunch of indicators that the supply lines are crumbling. She's bought basic 1950s food ingredients to basically make food, which is quite funny because she's clearly not a cook. She's never cooked, she's never looked after kids, all her meals have been takeout or airline food. But she knows she has to adapt, and she's acted to get the ingredient lists that she needs to make this food, and she's found a place, a magazine, an old magazine, where she can actually read the ingredient list and figure out how to prepare apples with flour and stuff like that. So the prepping neighbour, who basically doesn't let her in the house and is nice but kind of weird, he just doesn't want anybody around him, and he tells her very early on, you better get a rifle, which is interesting because there are some possible shots go off at part of this book in the distance. Nothing really happens in terms of violence because people are too hungry, or people are too scared, or people don't really have the motivation to use violence. This is very rural America. One of the neighbours she's really attracted to, who's I believe a widower or divorced, he has a son who's really attracted to Kamala, and the son gets very sick, as they do, and you hemorrhage out your eyeballs with this particular disease. He gets very sick, they take him to the hospital, desperately trying to get him care, and the doctor says there's nothing we can do, nothing. If it was my son, I'd take him home and be with him when he dies, not dump him here. So that's what they do. This disease, when it does kill you, kills you very painfully. Medicine, Giselle called out to Dr. Stark from the car window. Dr. Stark turned again, shrugged and said, "Got any? We don't have huge stocks of anything in our present society." So I would recommend you get a copy of this in the library. I wouldn't invest the cash in buying it unless you've read her stuff before and like it, in which case I'm pretty sure you'll like this one. It was $13.99 American, but it probably cost me $20 because we get ripped off in Canada. It passed a few hours, I quite enjoyed it. I didn't get bored. I found it quite interesting. I liked the way the prep stuff and the disaster stuff is in the background. That the story is really front and centred about her relationship with these 3 kids, this absent husband, what happened, why he married her, what it means, her bad relationship with her mother, why they have a bad relationship, what happens through the Phoenix flu to actually bring the human components, the mother and the daughter together, the stepchildren together with the stepmother, all of that stuff, how it brings the neighbour together, how things go on. One of the interesting threats in the book is actually wildlife. Mountain lions come back into the area and they are a threat. They're not a direct threat. She encounters a mountain lion. She's not going through people's houses particularly. She goes through one house very late on and gets a rifle out of it from the prepper. He had no food left and he hadn't stocked enough food and he died of the flu. So he tried to protect himself with his rifle and probably a limited amount of food, like maybe 3 or 6 months, and had read books and probably watched YouTube videos and felt he was prepped. Turned out he died, and he wasn't prepped, not for a society collapse. There is a suggestion in the book, right at the end of course, that society might rebuild. Anyway, that's all for me. If you like this, give me a subscription or a thumbs up. If you didn't, give me a thumbs down. I am getting used to my new place. Key did this, and I will give you a spin around of 360 degrees so you can see what my office basement looks like. No longer orange, and having been partially staged, getting ready for our sale.
This has been a Dog in a Bonnet Productions.
2021.